This morning, we are moving forward on our series on joy, not fickle happiness that can shift and change as our circumstance changes, but joy that is deep and available to and for and within us, no matter our circumstance. Joy that is a source of strength and the foundation of resilience. This week, I felt prompted to tweak the title of our series just a little bit to Rooted in Joy. My image was kind of already saying that, and I'm not exactly sure why the words didn't come to me earlier. But as I've been pondering joy, it seems that even when shaken or displaced, it is joy that roots us and allows us the resilience to hold on even when enduring extreme challenges. It's been beautiful, the different discussions I've found myself in this past week. I've been jotting things down, things that people have said about joy this week. Joy is our responsibility. Joy is contagious. Joy is something we are blessed to share. There is joy in hard work. All of these are beautiful. And our scripture for today, we will explore how there is joy also to be found in rest. Last week, we looked at the creation story found in Genesis 1, a beautiful poem written by exiles during exile who were able to look out at their world, their captors' land, having been uprooted, their own homes destroyed. And even in these circumstances, the writers of Genesis 1 affirmed a God who is good, a creator speaking creation into being, creating order out of chaos, blessing each step along the way, seeing that it was good, 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 supremely good. What a hopeful way of seeing the world in their new reality. A reality which for them had to have been filled with quite a bit of despair. We shouldn't underestimate the profound expression of hope and faith written by exiles whose life circumstances were not supremely good. In many ways, their life was supremely awful, but they seem to have discovered in ways that mattered, in subversive ways that their captors could never take away from them. Their God of creation was good. Their God of creation could and would make order out of the chaos in their situation. And there was hope and joy to be found. Today we're going to continue with the story, picking up where we left off as the Genesis 1 narrative of good, 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 supremely good creation spills over into Genesis 2. This is Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3. The heavens and the earth and all who live in them were completed. On the sixth day, God completed all the work that God had done. And on the seventh day, God rested from all the work that God had done. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it, God rested from all the work of creation. This is beautiful, profoundly, defiantly resistant, and beautiful. All of the work of creating, after all of this work, God set aside the seventh day for holy rest. Now, I have to admit that sometimes when I'm discerning the promptings of the Spirit as I prepare for worship, it's sometimes difficult for me to discern if this message is individually just for me or if this is a message that holds wisdom for all of us. It has been a very busy week, a good but very full week. And so if this message today is just for me, then I apologize. Though I do think that this work-rest balance is something that we all struggle with in our own ways. And it is something, when it gets out of balance, that can threaten to zap our connection with joy. So, the creation story. Many of the stories in the Hebrew Bible have parallels in other texts written in context of the ancient Near East neighbors of the Hebrews. Creation and uncreation stories, uncreation in the Hebrew Bible being the flood, these biblical stories were not written in a vacuum. These same themes and variations of stories exist in ancient literature from around the region as people struggled to make sense of the world and find answers to those existential questions. Who are we? How did we get here? Why are we here? While our biblical stories have many parallels in ancient Near East literature, it is really interesting to learn that Sabbath, this concept of holy rest, is unique to the Hebrew Bible among its contemporaries. Interestingly, Sabbath has no convincing parallels. It is a distinctive of the Hebrew Bible. Scholars are unsure just when the Sabbath became part of Hebrew practice, but by the time of the Babylonian exile, Sabbath observance was a hallmark of Jewish practice. And even in exile, they observed Sabbath. I think this is mind-blowing. The Babylonians, of course, had their own stories and their own texts. The Enuma Elish is a Babylonian parallel to Genesis 1. But in the Enuma Elish, the gods created humans to do their work so that the gods could enjoy a life of leisure. The way that the Enuma Elish imagines it, the people were essentially created to be slaves to the gods. But now contrast this to Genesis 1. Humans are created, blessed, and given dominion over every living thing. Now, this dominion thing always bristles me a little when I read this in Genesis 1. I always prefer to think of humans as being tasked with stewardship, to care for creation, because we really have abused this concept of dominion, twisting and turning it to mean that we are privileged to bend and break creation in any way that suits our whim. But if we put this story into its proper context, a story written by exiles who were no longer in control of their own lives, held captive in Babylon, then this is powerful stuff, boldly claiming, "You don't have dominion over me." Now, the Enuma Elish, along with other Babylonian texts, would have been read aloud during the spring festival, so the exiles would have been familiar with this story. But the writers of Genesis 1 say, no thanks. This may be your God, but this is our story. This is our God. A God who does the hard work of creating good and then rests and invites the newly created humans into that same life-giving pattern. This is serious resistance to unjust power structures. The exiles observed Sabbath even in exile, and that in and of itself is just mind-blowing. It is as if they were saying to their captors, "Your gods may demand of you work, but our good God has gifted us with rest." You know, we read in Exodus that it was during the Exodus that God instituted holy rest for God's people as one of the 10 Commandments. And this is huge for a people who had just been liberated from oppression in Egypt. The Pharaoh had demanded of them more and more work, more and more productivity, with less and less time to rest, just to feed his desire and drive for more. Rather than a blessed abundance experienced by all creation, the Pharaoh was accumulating more and more and demanding more and more labor of the Hebrews to support his greed. But this story isn't an isolated story. The exiles knew this kind of excessive accumulation at the hands of the powerful and at the expense of the powerless. As we read the prophets, this is part of Israel's story too. Before exile, Jeremiah warned Judah until he was blue in the face of what was coming if the king and the temple authorities continued to build bigger and more elaborate structures, accumulating more and more wealth while ignoring the plight of the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger among them. We look at Solomon's story, and for all of the wisdom with which he was attributed, Solomon succumbs to the allure of accumulating surplus at the expense of the people. Over 700 wives, elaborate palaces, this bigger is better mindset sets the wheels in motion that led to a divided kingdom and eventually to exile. Israel and Judah crumbled under the weight and were vulnerable to their more powerful neighbors. I imagine that some of the Babylonian exiles were part of this elite. The priestly class who was writing this poem, it's part of their story. And this is part of our story too. Excess that we think will make us happy, make our lives better, often ends up doing the opposite. We end up working for our stuff rather than our stuff working for us. And worse yet, we end up harming others and creation in the process. Now, I appreciate the appeal of Marie Kondo's approach in her best-selling book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. I personally think I find a little too much joy in random, eclectic things to ever fully embrace her minimalist sensibilities. The book part alone would be a deal breaker for any seminarian, but her process is really interesting. She invites people in this process of tidying up to pull everything out and sort it. There's a very specific order and method to this sorting. And then in a very embodied way, you are asked to pick up each item, hold it in your hands, and ask, does this spark joy? Not the question I usually ask, like, could I use this someday? But no, does this spark joy? If it doesn't, Marie Kondo says it's got to go. Really thinking about this, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this process at the beginning, before we acquire, instead of after we have accumulated and need to purge? But really, this is a beautiful question to ponder as we think about curating our lives, using joy as our yardstick. Does this spark joy? And what if we did this not just for our stuff, but also for our time, for our schedules? There will always be a measure of things that we must do that we would prefer not to do. But what if the question, does this spark joy, was considered when we are making decisions about our calendars? We need rest and fun in order to be able to do our work, our difficult, meaningful, valuable work with integrity and joy. Work is holy. Work provides a service, creates a product, provides for our families, offers dignity that comes from a job well done. In work, we find joy in purpose and meaning. Some of my most fond memories of my childhood and adolescence involve not vacations, because we didn't take many of those, but working really hard together as a family. Work is holy and rest is holy. This balance is not always easy to find. I'll admit that the Spirit has been kind of nudging me this week. Are you practicing what you're preaching? We all have a lot of demands on our times. And as compassionate people, we also have an abundance of demands on our hearts. There are so many worthy causes to support, so many needs to be addressed, so many of ways available to engage. Often there are way more opportunities than we have energy. Finding that right balance can be a challenge. The work-rest balance is something that I struggle with. Too often, I find myself kind of trying to just keep my nose to the grindstone. It's kind of that Protestant work ethic that gone wild at times. Get this done, and then if there is time, I will squeeze in a little R&R. Then I will deserve it. But this week in Genesis, I made a discovery that I had never really noticed or thought about before. When we all know how this story goes, God created for 6 days. God worked hard. And then on the 7th day, God rested. God's work came first. I think I often approach work like this. Get your work done first, and then when that work is good enough, you can rest and appreciate it. But you know what? For the newly created humans tasked with managing and caring for the vastness of creation, for these newly created humans, the rest came first. On the 6th day, God created them in the divine image. And then on the 7th day, there was rest. The rest came first. Sometimes I imagine these things in crazy ways. And this week I was kind of thinking about this like the Super Bowl commercial, where they come up to someone and say, "You've just won the Super Bowl. What are you going to do next?" And the person says, "I'm going to Disney World." But instead I imagined it this way. You've just been created and entrusted and empowered with great responsibility. Lots of work to do. What will you do first? And the answer is, we're going to rest. The rest came first. And this was a light bulb moment for me this week. They hadn't done anything to deserve the rest. It was given as a gift. I found this helpful as I oftentimes think that I need to work to deserve my rest, and then I kind of set that bar really unreasonably high. But rest is a divine gift. The God of creation trusts that the good work that will follow will come from a place of restedness. When we are overextended, when our plate is too full, when we are running on fumes, it is hard to find joy. How could we find joy if we don't have time to appreciate the joyful, good things that are around us? After all, this is what the first Sabbath rest was about. Setting aside time to appreciate the goodness of creation, to enjoy the fruits of the labor, the supremely good results of good work. When we foster a healthy work-rest balance, we are able to appreciate the holy in creation around us. We're able to see God's handiwork in our own lives as well. Ultimately, we recognize, celebrate, and find joy in the goodness of the Creator. The creation story is written from the perspective of exiles, from whom pretty much everything of value had been taken. But from our first world vantage, with our first world problems that many times stem from accumulating and consuming too much of a good thing, I think that this text really calls us to consider, how do we live alongside and in balance with all of the abundance in creation? How do we cultivate right relationship of work and rest, abundance and moderation that leads to joy and flourishing for all of creation? Today I'm going to close with a poem by Wendell Berry. Whatever is foreseen in joy must be lived out from day to day. Vision held open in the dark by our 10,000 days of work. Harvest will fill the barn. For that, the hand must ache, the face must sweat. And yet, no leaf or grain is filled by work of ours. The field is tilled and left to grace, that we may reap. Great work is done while we sleep. When we work well, a Sabbath mood rests on our day and finds it good.